So what I'm going to try and do is to speak to some of the issues that it is presenting, and it's an ongoing analysis from ourselves as an organisation. We are an NGO and charity that's been in existence since 2002, and we're an independent law centre as well that provides legal representation to migrants free of charge for difficult issues within the immigration system. So we look at it kind of through a legal lens in some ways, which informs a little bit of what I'm going to say this evening. So globally, basically, migration is at a crossroads. With over 50 million people experiencing displacement and other forms of migration increasing, the question of how individual states and the European Union react to this new migration reality has never been a more pressing one. In my 15 years working in the area of human rights and migration, I've never seen a time in which migration has been so much to the forefront in public consciousness and so much of an issue. It is at the point where we rightly, I think, call it a humanitarian disaster that's multi-layered and complex, but has at its core the tragic plight of men, women and children who are trying to putting themselves in very difficult and dangerous circumstances, in some cases for a chance at a better life, and in many cases for a chance of a life at all. In the context of people fleeing war, terrorism, human rights abuses, climate change and poverty, where people will take whatever routes and means are available to them to travel, however dangerous, the current migration context can be seen or could be seen as a new phenomenon, but in reality it's one that's been building for years but took a confluence of catastrophes really to drive it into its present form. So what has precipitated the current situation? The Syrian conflict, of course, being one area. Prior to that, the Afghan and Iraq wars, of course. Human rights abuses in many African countries and many Middle Eastern countries, absolutely. Economic disparity, inequality and lack of opportunity coupled with endemic mismanagement, corruption and exploitation. Yes, absolutely, that is a driving factor. Climate change, taking the livelihoods of borderline impoverished people away from them. All of these things and more are contributing to what we would look at as kind of a confluence of disasters at the moment. But it's very tempting to say that all these things together has made like a perfect storm. All these things have made kind of a confluence of occurrences that led to a mass movement of people, with the Syrian conflict acting as the final catalyst for the movement of humanity that followed. But if you look at these issues, or if you remove these issues, does everything go back to normal? And what does normal even look like? For me and for the Immigrant Council of Ireland, there's an overarching issue that many of us have been talking about for years. And the backdrop of these issues that we face now is essentially how we handle migration in a global context. If you look at other areas in the globe, between South and Central America and North America, in Asia, between Asia and Africa, it is clear that while in our locality the issues I mentioned before are the current predominant driving factors, they're repeated across the globe, maybe identified by a different name, a different human rights abuse scenario, a different conflict, a different form of inequality, all called different things but existing all the same. So if all these are present in different variations globally, what are the root cause, or is there another issue that links them? And as I said, for me, the additional lens is the realization that migration policy and legislation globally is in many ways now not fit for purpose, and in some effect, it is broken. I say that conscious that that's with a touch of hyperbole. For many people, migration is not broken at all, it's worked just fine. But those are in general the categories of migrants that fit more easily within restrictive parameters. So if you're relatively well off, if you possess a skill or qualification that we need in this country, if your family can show ample evidence that they can support you, do you speak a language that we need? If so, you likely fit within a strand of migration that is sought after. And there's nothing wrong at all with states seeking to attract those that they perceive to meet the needs of the economy or the market as it stands right now. But that is at its essence an economically driven migration policy. And what we need is a human rights-based migration policy that deals with the reality of the changed migration context globally. For those who would say, that sounds great, Brian, but we are in a recession, It's a mistake made yet and yet again to think that human rights and economic considerations are mutually exclusive. A short research online will show you there are countless reports on how migrants contribute to host countries in terms of innovation, energy, taxes, new skills and entrepreneurship, far more than they receive in terms of benefits and supports. Countless reports will show you how, if managed properly with investment in integration, migration can be a boon, a shot in the arm for receiving countries. Yes, there are issues, there are problems, but nothing that can't be handled if it's managed properly. So economics and human rights are not mutually exclusive. You can have a human rights immigration policy that reaps economic benefits for the host country, as well as a slew of other benefits, culturally, in terms of diversity, in terms of languages, age profiles, demographics, and everything I mentioned earlier. The current context is driven by extreme factors, and many of those moving are doing so out of desperation, but what they are meeting is a wall. And the wall is a selective, narrow and restrictive vision of migration that to date has been manageable from the perspective of states and governments. This old understanding of migration is now changing and has been doing so for years. And if we do not now come up with a new global vision for migration that informs the future, we will remain in a state of firefighting. Thousands will die every year seeking to enter other countries. Millions and billions will be spent hand over fist in the foreseeable future to little or no avail. And thousands of young people and little kids like Alan Kurdi will wash up on the shores of countries all over the world. That might sound very, very dramatic, but to be honest, when we look at the current context we're in, it's realistic to say that. To move very temporarily from this big picture and this big global question to a front close to home, the Immigrant Council of Ireland have recently undertaken some exploratory trips in Calais, Dunkirk and Cherbourg in northern France, a front of the current crisis. We went there with the aims of assessing the situation and the needs on the ground there to determine what supports we can provide there as a law centre that will help give people legal channels out of the situation that they're in, especially unaccompanied minors and a lot of the children that are there. We went to link in with the existing legal infrastructure that was there, mainly volunteer-based, and to give an Irish lens to that. And to bring aid in the form of supports and funding to those working directly on the ground there. What we saw in Calais and what we continue to see in northern France is an aspect of the current humanitarian crisis that's deep and embedded and is being met essentially with violence and hostility by the authorities there. But we saw, as well as this desperation, resilience, hope, and a deep humanity among the refugees and migrants there and among the volunteers working there as well. Approximately 5,000 people live in the Calais camp, with 500 or so of those being children. In Dunkirk, there were approximately 1,200 people, again, many children. And in Cherbourg, there are a couple of hundred people whose intention is primarily to get to Ireland, and many of those are unaccompanied minors as well, so many kids involved too. All are taking desperate and dangerous routes to try and move forward. They're trying to get into the back of trucks and trains every single night, often injuring themselves horrifically in the process. They're being preyed upon by smugglers and traffickers. They're being beaten and targeted by right-wing fascist gangs and riot police. It's unimaginable that this is Europe in 2016, and yet there it is. The conditions are well documented, and in fact, increasingly I'm conscious that many people have gone there to volunteer, so some of you may have already seen the conditions there or know people who have gone there to try and help out. So I won't dwell on them too much, but what I will talk about is what we came away with the impression. We came away with the feeling that the situation is desperate, that it's complete madness that it's happening as it is, but that it is fixable. It is not an impossible task. The answer is not tear gas and bulldozers. The answer is supports, empathy, rights, legal advice, and ultimately legal paths for people to move beyond their current impasse. We're now working there to augment the legal initiatives and there to provide a focused support for those who have family members in Ireland. We're seeking to provide legal advice, information and referrals possibilities so that we can put our skills to use. We're seeking to establish training and support structures there around issues such as trafficking and gender-based violence, and to make whatever small contribution we can to try and ensure that people are treated with some dignity. So when we look at this particular example and we try and fit it into the global context, the same broad questions come out of it for me in our work, and that is an emerging and high-level chorus of voices that are stating the belief that the expansion and strengthening of legal routes for migration, coupled with increased investment in integration, is what is needed to address this situation in the future. What is required is a sustainable response which informs a vision of future global migration that has human rights and dignity at its core. This is not open borders, as some would allege. It's a more fluid, responsive, flexible vision of migration that responds to the fact that people are more mobile now than they ever have been at any point in human history. And that bears repeating, I think. People are now more mobile and more interconnected than at any other point in human history. This mobility and interconnectedness will increase exponentially into the future. So will we still be building fences in 50 years' time and pulling people from the Mediterranean? Will we still be tear gassing people while politicians and civil servants in Brussels rack their brains for new and inventive ways to push people back? This, I do not believe, is what most people want. I do not believe that the majority of politicians or civil servants want that either. Innately, we want each other to be treated with dignity and with humanity. And innately, we want each other, or innately we know that we have nothing to fear from migration and everything to gain if we respond to it appropriately. For my very last point, I will give you a short story from our recent trips to northern France, and a return to Dunkirk, where I have an image in my head that always resounds with me. As of last year, I am a new dad, and I have a gorgeous 16-month-old daughter with my wife. She was seemingly born without whatever gene makes children sleep at night, much to our dismay. But we still love her. We love her more if she slept, but we still love her. So I take that lens when I look at a lot of things now, and it may be cheesy to say that, but to be honest, I do take that lens when I look at things, and it impacts upon me a lot. In Dunkirk camp, I was struck by an image. One day we were sitting at a bench in the camp, and I was talking to volunteers there. And over one of the volunteers' shoulders, I could see a dad pushing his little daughter on a swing. Now, this wasn't a proper swing. This was a swing made out of bits of wood and twine that somebody had put together in the middle of the camp. And for me, this is an image that says that dad was trying to say to his daughter that even though we live in complete chaos, you are still a little girl and you could still be a child in some way, even in the middle of all of this. And for me, it struck me as an image of there's absolutely no difference between me and him in these circumstances. There's no difference between his daughter and my daughter. There's no difference between my intentions for my daughter and his intentions for his daughter, only for the circumstances that we're in. He lives in complete chaos and we live in Wicklow. We're in wildly different circumstances, but what connects us is our basic humanity, and that's the route that we must follow courageously if we're to find the solution that we desire to the current migration crisis. And that's an image that I'll leave you with. So thank you very much, folks. Cheers.